Hello, good evening, everyone. As we know that uh, the classes have been suspended for some time, and we are not being able to meet up very soon because of the fact that because of the shutdown that has happened as a result of the COV 18 outbreak. I would request all of you to stay safe, stay at home, and maybe if this gives you an opportunity to study, I think you should devote yourself to that. Now, without further ado, the reason why I am doing this series of video lectures, I want to mention at the outset that there will be 3 to 4 lectures which I'm going to make in the form of a video, so that we can make up for the time lost. Since you know that your examinations are also drawing near, we also need to have time for revisions. So, in order to make up for the time lost, I have decided to make these video lectures because if you look at your syllabus, I have one thing that is left to be done, which is in the romantic section, the section on romantic literature, and that which is left to be done is the novel that you have this time, which is Frankenstein. Uh, Today, what I will do is I have already jotted down a few points that I would be talking about, a few ideas that I will be talking about in this lecture, and this is not an exhaustive lecture in the sense that there are a lot of things which are missing, a lot of things that need to be taught, that a lot of things need to be touched upon. But yes, to avoid the disadvantages of an online lecture, a lecture where you do not have a face-to-face interaction, I've tried to minimize as many disadvantages as possible, and I've tried to therefore include not just one but 2 to 3 of these lectures so that it is of benefit to all of you. Uh, the first and I would also like to mention at the outset that I am making these lectures, and these lectures will obviously, as I said, not be exhaustive, but at the same time, you can use and can take recourse to these lectures in the course of your reading of the novel. And the 2 to 3 lectures, the all of these lectures together will actually contribute to your understanding of the novel, uh, taken as a whole, holistically. And I would also like to mention that these lectures will come not immediately one after the other. This is the lecture I'm making this week. Obviously, I would try to ensure that in 2 days' time or 3 days' time, maybe after this lecture has been circulated, uh, I will make the second lecture on the same subject, on the same novel, covering some other aspects. Now, what I would like you to do is, I would like you to circulate this video, circulate these lectures as much as possible so that they can be of benefit to your friends. They can be of immense help, okay, in the time when we actually have to rush through with the syllabus, but for certain circumstances, we are not able to do so. So that much for the introduction. Let me just talk about what we are going to discuss today. What is the novel about? Uh, a little bit background, as we have already done in class. If you followed my lectures in class, I've already talked to you. I've spoken to you about the historical background of Romanticism, how Romanticism came to dominate the literary scene. What were uh, the primary events, historical and social and political, that led to the uh, that contributed in its own way to the emergence of this movement. I also talked about the philosophical idea behind Romanticism and the way in which Romanticism differs from uh, certain schools of thought that spoke about, in the sense that it does not completely break away from that school, but it is trying to challenge that school and posit its own way of understanding the world. One of which, obviously, as we were discussing in the last day in class, was empiricism, positivism. Now, what happens in positivism? one of the trenchant critiques of Berkeley is given by Coleridge in his biography, A Literaria, where he compares the idea of sense perception to be the ultimate source of the revelation of knowledge, to be, he considers this idea to something that is able to conveniently reduce the human being to a pebble that can be, moved aside, thrust aside by the wind, by the waves, without its ability to actually react to this. The imagination as a faculty is not opposed to reason in the sense that it says that imagination must be the only thing that you must adopt. Rather, imagination is opposed to reason as reason in the sense reason as dominated by the school of thought that relies on sense perceptions, empirical school of thought, the positivist school of thought that laid the foundation of modern science in Europe with the coming of the Enlightenment. What happens is imagination is opposed to reason, so much so that imagination offers itself as another faculty that can be looked upon, a faculty that does not make the human being dependent on the senses and also therefore on the external world that is to be perceived, but also his ability to create his perception of the world. So if you have darkness, you don't consider it to be an obstruction in the romantic in the romantic point of view. Darkness itself becomes empowering, in the sense darkness enables you to let go of this dependence on your sense perception and thereby create, thereby interpret, thereby make your own understanding of what lies beyond that path of darkness. Okay? We have discussed all this. Now, about the novel, I will skip these little details which you can find in Wikipedia about when the novel was published and other such very trivial details which are obviously important, but you can obviously take recourse to Wikipedia for that. As you know, the novel is written by Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, and a little bit about the author first, because it is important to understand the authorial background before going into the novel. Mary Shelley was the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, two very famous radical thinkers, radical thinkers in England at this time, which is the early part of the 19th century. They dominated they even dominated the political landscape even before this, which is in the 18th century also. The early part of the 19th century was the time when the novel is written. Okay, but the political landscape is at this time very fraught with contradictions, because in 1789 you have the French Revolution, and the French Revolution ushers in a completely new way of understanding society and politics, because it is the first time, it is one of, if not the first time, it is one of those very significant historical events that puts to question the divine right of kingship, that the kings are born to rule and that kings can never be overthrown, that monarchy itself cannot be overthrown. It puts to question this very fundamental principle and precept on which the understanding of the old feudal order was based. The feudal order of, a hierarchical system where you have the king and then you have the vassals, then you have the knights and so on and so forth. This order remaining unchanged. But in the French Revolution, for the first time, you have if not the first time, I keep on repeating that, because there was also the Glorious Revolution in England. In the French Revolution, you have a complete overhauling of this idea that social structures and strictures and hierarchical structures must be kept intact. The fact that there can be a rebellion emerging from the third estate and thereby completely crushing the power of the first estate and so on. That is why radicalism is understood as a break from certain conventional ideas, certain conventional ways of perceiving politics. certain conventional ways of perceiving society, which is what the French Revolution is doing. Now, at this time, many radical thinkers who were present even before, who were a source of influence during the French Revolution, radical for their own times, Rousseau and the like, had also contributed in their own way to the development of philosophical ideas that challenged the old social orders. Right? And at the same time, there were conservative thinkers like Edmund Burke, who talks about how the French Revolution was actually a disease that had crept in to the social life of England. But at the same time, there were also radical thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft in England, William Godwin, and then you have Rousseau in France, and so on and so forth. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that with the emergence of radical philosophies, there emerges a tradition of philosophical and social thinkers in other parts of Europe, because the epicenter of the revolution is France, who came to be called the Jacobites, the Jacobin from the Jacobin Club, because they played one of the pioneering roles in providing the intellectual spirit of the revolution, the intellectual message of the revolution, the intellectual beacon of the revolution. Now, you will find references to Jacobites throughout this piece. You will find references to Jacobites throughout this. In fact, I'm the doctor who creates the monster. I'll go into the novel's gist, but for the moment, the protagonist of the novel, Victor Frankenstein, himself belongs to the Jacobite scene. Okay, and therefore there was the association of Jacobites with all kinds of social actions that were radical for their own times. For example, it was believed, and there is a small reference in the novel to the fact that Jacobites were used to open graves, in order to experiment with dead bodies. Something that was forbidden, was iconoclastic, because the church had forbidden it. But the Jacobites would do that. So there is a reference to grave digging also in the novel. The Jacobites are represented as people who question tradition. Now, in the bid to question tradition, what they do is they take recourse to, or they rely on very innovative ideas of modern science, very innovative ideas related to technology, and see how technology itself can be extended into their very recesses. Technology can be extended so much so that you can have completely radical breaks in the way technology functions at this time. Victor Frankenstein, for example, is schooled in that tradition. And Victor Frankenstein therefore rejects the old medieval thinkers, and what he ends up doing, creating a monster, creating life therefore, not a monster first, we have doubts about the question of the monster, creating life itself. Okay, that idea of creating life itself using science, the idea therefore of the challenging certain iconoclastic traditions of the church, certain prescriptions of the church, certain forbidding, certain bids of forbidding by the church. Okay? That persists, and probably one of the reasons why Mary Shelley could not think beyond this character of a Jacobite as the protagonist was because of her own influence within the family, because she was the daughter of two most radical thinkers at the time, William Godwin and Mary Shelley. And William Godwin was such a famous radical thinker that in his house there used to be gatherings of some of the most important influential minds of the time. It was in these gatherings that she met her future husband, P.B. Shelley. Okay, and they married each other. They got married very soon. Now the thing is, William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft, who was her mother, was one of the first and the leading feminist thinkers. Obviously, William Godwin was a radical, so was Mary Wollstonecraft, but Mary Wollstonecraft was also one of the leading feminist thinkers talking about the rights of women. In fact, one of her very famous pieces, one of her very famous essays is entitled "A Vindication of the Rights of Women," okay, where she basically says Thomas Paine was one such radical who talks of the rights of man. Thomas Paine was also famous among the radical circles. Thomas Paine was in fact influenced very much by the French Revolution, but what she does is she extends Thomas Paine's ideas. She talks about Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man and says how exactly are these rights applicable to women? Why exactly are they rights of man? Okay, so she is obviously radical, as much radical as Godwin, as much radical as Thomas Paine, but also a feminist, talking about the rights of women, the liberal rights of women. Okay. Now the thing is, Mary Wollstonecraft, and obviously you can say Mary Shelley has inherited that, so she was also quite exposed to feminist ideas while she was growing up. And the point is, Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother, died when she was young, and following this, she had a very troubled relationship with her father because her stepmother, her father married again. Her stepmother was not quite comfortable with Mary Wollstonecraft's Mary Shelley's kind of relationship with her father. As a result of which, she had a very, very disturbed childhood where she could not mingle with her other cousins, her stepbrothers, her stepsisters. So she would spend most of her time alone, isolated, okay? And one thing that she had recourse to was the books that her father had. The copious books that her father had, the copious sources of knowledge that her father had in the library. That was one of her favorite pastimes. She would read because she obviously did not have any companion, so to speak. We will see how this disturbed mindset, this troubled relationship, this problematic relationship that Mary Shelley had in the Godwin household, in the household of a radical. The contradiction is, she is in the house of a radical, but then she does not have her own rights. Okay, this kind of a relationship, how does it affect the writing of the novel? We are going to see that in subsequent lectures when we delve deeper into the novel. I'm going to also talk to you in this lecture about the narrative structure of the novel and the introduction of the genre called the Gothic. The Gothic is an umbrella term. It encompasses a whole lot of subgenres, but I'm going to talk to you about the Gothic, how the Gothic impacts and influences traditions, and exactly why does the Gothic develop and flourish to such a wide extent in the Romantic period, where you have the flush of imagination, the first flushes of imagination and creativity and all of these ideas. Alongside these flushes, you have something like the Gothic flourishing. What in fact is the Gothic? To summarize it very simplistically, the Gothic refers to a certain genre of writing, a certain category of writing, with all bleak and dark elements represented in it, without the flushes of blossoming kind of romance, without the even if there is romance depicted, romance in the strictest sense of the term, even if there is romance depicted, it's a very twisted romance. Okay, The Castle of Otranto was the first Gothic novel that was written by Horace Walpole, and you have the case of the twisted romance where somebody you have incestuous relationships depicted within the family. Okay, romance that centers on these incestuous relationships, romance which is supposed to be a very gentle and benign idea. Okay, romance which is supposed to be very gentle, very benign. When it comes within the throes of the Gothic, it does not be it is not represented as genuine, as benign and as gentle as you find it in other genres, because the Gothic transforms and modifies it so much so that it becomes a twisted tale. Incest, Okay, maybe the case of a boy loving a girl where the girl is murdered. So you have all sorts of bleak depictions. You have supernatural elements depicted. Okay, also the very Gothic was also dominated in its in at its very stage of its at the very stage of its inception. The Gothic was dominated by a particular kind of architecture. So if there are two genres where the Gothic showed its remarkable influence, one was obviously in literature, and the other was also in architecture. I was talking to you about Horace Walpole, The Castle of Otranto, which is believed to be the first of its kind, at least the first English Gothic novel of its kind. Now, Horace Walpole also had built for himself a Gothic castle in England. Okay. So it also came to dominate architecture as an art form. And what was this kind of architecture like? This kind of architecture was dominated by, let us say a big castle with subterranean corridors, subterranean halls, subterranean rooms. Subterranean in the sense you don't really see them, it does not appear to the naked eye. You open a vault and that leads to another room. You open that vault and that leads to a candlelit corridor. Okay, something like that. So the architecture itself reveals that the home is not known. You are supposed to know your home, right? Because the home would seem homely only when it is known. But what happens in this case is the home itself is not known. You do not know what one thing is going to lead to. You do not know where one corridor is going to lead to another. You have these dark passages where light does not enter. Darkness, right? Let me now go back to that one suggestion that I made earlier about darkness and how darkness was important to the Romantics. I was talking to you about darkness, fog, obstruction, smog, okay, anything that blocks your view. I also mentioned in class the famous poem, The Wanderer on the Sea of Fog, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, as a painting depicting one of the quintessential Romantic paintings. What happens is the wanderer confronts the fog. The fog is not a cause of obstruction. The Romantics do not consider darkness to be an obstruction. Remember Coleridge's Dejection, an ode which you have in your syllabus this time. Dejection talks about how you can basically use dejection or use sadness as a tool to enhance its own creativity. So you bring out, you recuperate, you recover the positive element in what is supposedly a negative concept. Okay, so the Romantics, it is by virtue of imagination that they were talking about the use of certain elements positively, no matter how bleak or dark they sounded. Darkness was one of them. Gray's Elegy. When is Thomas Gray composing his elegy? As a pre-Romantic? In the dark graveyards, when it is actually going to, when the daylight is slowly fading. The curfew tolls the bell of parting, the curfew tolls the knell of parting day. But that is the moment when he chooses to observe, because he confronts darkness. He does not let darkness get the better of him. Right? In the Gothic, now come to the Gothic, because darkness is an quintessential lack of knowledge along with darkness, because you have these dark corridors that you do not know, your home itself is unhomely to you, you're unfamiliar to you. Come to the Gothic, what happens is in the portrayal of darkness in the Gothic and the portrayal of darkness in the Romantic, they have a similarity. The similarity lies in the fact that in both these ideas, in both these ways of understanding literature, darkness is viewed as a positive concept because it enables the imagination to flourish. But how? At what cost? In the case of the Romantic poet, in the case of Wordsworth, in the case of even Thomas Gray, even in the case of Coleridge, you have darkness emerging obviously as a positive concept, darkness emerging as an enabling concept instead of a disabling concept, but that in fact is shown to be very therapeutic, in the sense that itself gives you a certain pleasure. The positivity that you derive, therefore, the imagination that you therefore use because something is dark, is enabling, but wholly enabling. It does not come at the cost of anything. In fact, it turns you into a more comfortable individual. Even in the case of Keats, you have that. Negative capability is a concept where you are foregoing your remember, suspension of belief. You are doing that willingly in order to gain a moment of peace, in order to gain a moment of comfort, in order to gain a moment of solace in the age of experience. In the case of the Gothic, the imagination flourishes as well, but the cost, you now have to pay a cost. The cost is mental delirium. Because when you see these dark corridors, you see these dark passages, you do not know, lack of knowledge. You do not know something that was supposed to be so enabling to the romantics. I mean, to the conventional romantics. Obviously, Gothics are romantics as well. To the conventional romantics, to maybe Coleridge, to Wordsworth, is now no longer coming without a cost. Because the moment you are imagining what lies on the other side of the corridor, it is giving you mental delusions. It is giving you mental images. Spirits are occurring to you in your dreams. Many other, kind of horror fantasy is kind of encompassing your imagination. So your imagination is obviously enabling you to do something, but it is coming at the cost of something else. The cost is turbulence instead of peace. Turbulence, mental turbulence instead of peace. So the Gothic and the Romantic, although they view the imagination as obviously a very powerful faculty, if not always positive, a powerful faculty, one of them establishes it as therapeutically positive. The other establishes it as obviously enabling, obviously powerful, but it comes at the cost of something. So in the same romantic age, you have two different ideas, the romantic idea towards the imagination and the Gothic idea towards the imagination. In fact, therefore the Gothic represents what Raymond Williams would call the the rather, if not the dominant discourse of the romantic period, not that which we understand initially when we talk about the romantic period, at least its hidden recesses. He would call this the emergent discourse, where the dominant discourse is represented by a certain category of writers, but at the same time a different view of imagination, a radically opposite view of imagination is also is seen to coexist with that. Frankenstein classifies itself as a Gothic novel because we are going to look at the places where exactly lack of knowledge is a very important indicator in the novel. What happens? Victor Frankenstein basically is a scientist who has returned from the University of Geneva, and he is a Jacobite. Now Victor Frankenstein decides to impart life to a corpse, and he believes that this is going to be the final testimony of his scientific temperament. What happens later on is that this project backfires because Frankenstein emerges. Obviously Frankenstein gives birth to this creature, but the moment he takes a first look at the creature, he's repulsed. He's repulsed by his own invention because of the appearance of the monster. This repulsion leads him to abandon the monster, abandon his own creation. What follows is the monster's revenge. He takes revenge upon his own creator. Okay? The entire story about the monster's revenge, the project backfiring, the fact that you do not know. You may claim to know everything because you are a scientist. You may claim to know everything as you are a man of science. You may claim to disregard old masters, medieval masters. And Frankenstein, you will see in the initial stages of the novel, he talks about medieval scientists, if we may call them scientists. Actually, he talks about medieval almost sorcerers, wizards in the medieval period, like Cornelius Agrippa. He talks about these people, and he says that I differ from Cornelius Agrippa because I am a man of modern science. I will be able to establish my own footing, my own foothold. Alright? Now the thing is, this disagreement with Cornelius Agrippa and these disagreements that he has had makes him almost a Faustian creature. Faustin, Faustian creature. who is too arrogant, too confident about his own claims to knowledge, as though he can know everything. This is precisely challenged when the monster strikes back. Not simply when the monster strikes back, also when he is repulsed by his own creation, driven to a point where he has to abandon his own creation. The lack of knowledge is put into question. We'll discuss more about the lack of knowledge when we go deeper into the novel in my next lecture. Another thing that I would like to discuss is the narrative structure. The novel, first of all, is not told by Victor Frankenstein. The novel is given to us, we get to hear of Victor Frankenstein's story from the letters written by a person called Robert Walton. It's Robert Walton's narrative. Who is Robert Walton? Robert Walton is a voyager, a man who goes out to the sea on a voyage, and he finds Victor Frankenstein's body, lying unconscious, and he reads his letters. And we as readers get to know about Victor Frankenstein through Robert Walton's narrative. So the novel begins with Robert Walton's narrative about Victor Frankenstein. What does Robert Walton do? Robert Walton is basically going to the North Pole in search of expedition. Remember, men of science again. A man of science again, going to the North Pole for an expedition in search of knowledge, where you have to go and visit a place. That same idea, of empiricism, positivism, where knowing is to know objectively. And why is he voyaging? He is a seafarer. He is a man out on an expedition, almost similar to Victor Frankenstein. Both of them are men on the quest for knowledge. Alright? Perhaps, therefore, Victor Frankenstein's narrative to Robert Walton, when Robert Walton reads Victor Frankenstein's letters, that might be a source of warning to him. That might also have its own therapeutic impact on him. Okay? This almost kind of mimics Coleridge's. Remember when we were talking about Coleridge's poems, I told you how both the reader and the poet are effectively conjoined in the process of creation. We have that in Kubla Khan, where the poet emerges, but the poet also begs the reader, the poet entreats the reader to gather his own creative element from his poetry. It must be recuperated. We must recuperate Kubla's creation through the poet. So the poet is the mediator. Both the poet and the reader are engaged in an act, essentially engaged in an act of co-creation, creativity. Okay? We have that in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge as well, the famous poem, where the mariner, remember, Robert Walton is a man who is a mariner.